Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. She called 911 because I locked down my own property. Then she demanded access. What started as a home renovation turned into a full-blown war with an unhinged HOA president who thought she owned the entire neighborhood. She messed with the wrong guy and paid the ultimate price. My name is Eric Dawson. I live with my wife and 2 kids on a peaceful stretch of land just outside a small suburban HOA-controlled neighborhood. The keyword here being outside asterisk. Our property line touches their community, but we've never been part of it. No monthly dues, no architectural review committee breathing down my neck, and certainly no permission slips required to sneeze on my own porch. It's my land, plain and simple. And after years of saving and planning, I was finally ready to give it the upgrade it deserved. The project was ambitious: a new composite shingle roof, full siding replacement with coastal-style panels, landscaping touch-ups, and the centerpiece, a custom cedar privacy fence that would wrap the entire property. It was something my wife, Lindsay, and I had talked about for years. She had her doubts at first, mostly about budget, timing, and whether I'd lose my mind dealing with contractors. But after 2 months of research, spreadsheets, and not-so-gentle debates, we were finally on the same page. Finding decent workers wasn't easy. I interviewed 7 different crews before settling on a team that seemed solid, licensed, experienced, with great reviews. We signed the contract, shook hands, and I prepaid the deposit for the materials and first week of labor. The crew said the entire job would take about a month if weather held. Perfect timing, because Lindsay and I had just planned a trip to her parents' place a few hours away. The kids would get spoiled, we'd get a break, and I could check in on the renovation from afar, thanks to a network of security cameras I'd installed around the house. The first few days went exactly as planned. Every evening, I'd log into the app and flip through the feeds. I watched as shingles were torn off, pallets of lumber delivered, walls stripped and prepped. There was a deep, satisfying joy in seeing the old house transform. Everything felt under control. If only it had stayed that way. It was the 5th day of construction when I got the call. I was sitting on the porch at my in-laws' place, sipping coffee and enjoying one of those rare, peaceful mornings where the kids were still asleep and the house was quiet. My phone rang, and I saw the name of my lead contractor, Luis, flash across the screen. I figured he had a question about materials or maybe ran into an issue with the siding. What I didn't expect was panic. "Eric," he said, voice tight, "I can't work on your property anymore." I blinked. "What do you mean you can't work? Is everything okay?" "No, man, it's not," he said. "Some woman came by this morning, said she was with the HOA. She started yelling that the work was illegal, that we didn't have approval, and that we had to stop immediately. She was recording us, taking pictures, said she was calling the city and the police." I sat up. "Wait, what woman? Describe her." "She said her name was Karen something, blonde hair, about 50, wore sunglasses like she was the mayor of the neighborhood. Bossy as hell. She said if we didn't leave, we'd be fined. Or worse." My stomach dropped. "That doesn't make any sense. You know I'm not part of that HOA, right?" "Look, man, I don't know who's who out there," Luis said, already defensive. "All I know is I'm not risking my license or my guys getting arrested because some neighborhood lady says you lied about permits. You should have told me this could be an issue. I'm pulling the crew out. And no, we're not refunding the deposit. You got us into a legal mess." Before I could protest, he hung up. I stood up so fast my chair nearly flipped. My heart was racing. I opened the security app and pulled up the footage from earlier that morning. Sure enough, there she was. A woman in a tailored beige windbreaker, oversized sunglasses, phone in hand, strutting across my yard like she owned it. I watched in disbelief as she berated my crew, waving her phone around like it was a badge. The workers looked shaken, confused. Within 15 minutes, they packed up and left. But what caught me most off guard was that she wasn't the HOA president I knew. The man who used to run the HOA, Richard Hines, was reasonable, if a bit strict. I'd met him once at a neighborhood meeting a couple years ago when they tried to rope my street into the association. He respected boundaries. This woman, she didn't just cross a boundary, she bulldozed through it. Fueled by frustration, I jumped in my truck and made the 2-hour drive back. The house looked like a ghost zone when I arrived. Tools abandoned, work half done, materials stacked untouched. The fence posts were still in the ground, but nothing more. No workers, no progress, just silence. I called Luis again. No answer. I texted. Nothing. My hands trembled with rage as I climbed back into the truck and headed straight for the HOA office. If this Karen wanted to play hardball, she was about to find out she picked the wrong property owner. The HOA office was located in a strip mall at the edge of the neighborhood, tucked between a dry cleaner and a chiropractic clinic. From the outside, it looked harmless. A plain glass door with a printed sign that read Oak Crest Community Association. But I knew better by now. I stepped inside, still running on adrenaline and a deep well of frustration. The front room was empty, save for a woman behind a desk tapping away at a computer. She looked up, gave me a tight smile, and said, "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to speak with the HOA president. Now." Her smile froze. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I snapped. "But it's urgent. I own the property on the edge of Brookside, and some woman named Karen just sabotaged my construction project by threatening my crew." The receptionist's lips twitched slightly. "You must be talking about Mrs. Holloway. She's in a meeting." I leaned forward. "Cancel it." Before she could answer, a familiar voice drifted from behind a nearby frosted glass door. "Let him in, Molly. I've been expecting this." The door creaked open, and there she stood. Karen. In the flesh. She looked exactly like in the camera footage. Pressed blazer, smug expression, and that unbearable air of authority she clearly thought the world had granted her. She gave me a smile as fake as her perfume and gestured toward her office. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I marched into the room and planted myself across from her desk. "You had no right to approach my contractors," I said. "You shut down work on my property, and now I'm out thousands of dollars and weeks of progress." Karen didn't flinch. In fact, she looked almost amused. "Mr. Dawson, was it? I don't appreciate being spoken to in that tone, and I'll remind you that this community has strict standards for exterior modifications, especially fencing." My blood boiled. "I am not in your community. I don't pay dues. I don't attend your meetings. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over my home, and you damn well know it." She folded her hands calmly on the desk. "We believe your property should be included in the HOA. Technically, your parcel touches our private roads and shares visual exposure with our residents. Therefore, it's in the best interest of the community that all major changes be subject to review." "That's a load of legal fantasy," I growled. "You have no authority over my land, and you scared off my crew with fake threats. You're lucky I'm not suing you already." That's when her tone shifted. "Oh, but you will be paying, starting with a fine for hostile conduct toward a board member, and another for unauthorized construction, and another." I stood up, voice rising. "Lady, you've lost your damn mind. I'm filing a restraining order, and if you so much as step foot near my property again..." Karen pressed a button beneath her desk. Before I could react, the office door swung open. The same guy I'd seen in the footage, the human brick wall, appeared in the doorway. 6 foot something, arms like tree trunks, bald head, soulless stare. He didn't say a word. He just walked over, grabbed me by the arm, and dragged me out. "What the hell? Get your hands off me!" I shouted, struggling. Karen's voice rang out from behind us like a final curse. "You've been warned, Mr. Dawson. Expect consequences." The security goon shoved me out the front door and let it slam behind me. I stood on the pavement, chest heaving, humiliated, furious, and stunned. That wasn't just an entitled HOA president. That was someone unhinged. Someone who thought she was untouchable. And if she wanted a war, she was going to get one. I didn't drive back to my in-laws' place that night. I couldn't. I was too rattled, too angry, and way too aware that I'd just been manhandled out of a public office by some overgrown bouncer on orders from a woman who had absolutely no legal claim over me. I spent the night in my truck, parked outside a diner with free Wi-Fi, going over security footage, contractor documents, and local zoning laws until the sun came up. The longer I sat with it, the more certain I became. Karen had crossed a serious line. The next morning, I walked straight into the local police department. I wasn't about to let this go. I met with an officer, explained everything. The threats, the sabotage, the intimidation of my contractors, and most importantly, that Karen had absolutely no jurisdiction over my property. I showed them the footage of the confrontation between her and my crew, and then the video of me being physically removed from her office by her hired muscle. To their credit, the officers took it seriously. One of them, Officer Timmons, watched the clips with narrowed eyes and took careful notes. "You're telling me she's claiming you're part of the HOA, but you're not?" "I've got the deed. My property was never annexed. No signature, no agreement, nothing." Timmons nodded. "All right, we can't charge her with trespassing yet. She didn't step foot on your land, but you have enough for a restraining order. We'll file a report, and I'll walk it through." I also filed a complaint against my contractor, Luis, not because I wanted to burn bridges, but because we had a signed contract. His abandonment of the project and refusal to return the deposit had crossed into breach of contract territory. I wasn't about to get bullied from both ends. Less than 24 hours later, Luis called me. His tone was completely different this time. No defensiveness, no arrogance, just nerves. "Eric, man, hey, look, I want to apologize. That lady really had me spooked. She told me you were under investigation, that permits were missing, and that if we didn't walk, we could be liable." "Let me guess," I said flatly. "She also claimed to be the law in this neighborhood?" Louis sighed. "Yeah, something like that." "Well," I said, "she's not. And I filed a police report. They're issuing a restraining order as we speak. You're in the clear if you want to finish the job." There was a pause. "We're coming back. Tomorrow. Full crew. And we'll stay out of HOA drama." "Good," I said, "because this time I'll be watching even closer." And I meant it. That night, I reconfigured every camera on my property. I expanded cloud backups, enabled 24/7 recording, and added new audio sensors on the fence line. I wasn't going to let anyone sneak around in the dark again. The construction would continue, but so would the defense. Karen had taken her shot. Now it was my turn to fight back by finishing what I started, brick by brick. 2 weeks later, everything seemed to be back on track. The crew had returned as promised, and the place was buzzing with energy. The roof was nearly finished, the siding looked incredible, and the framework for the new cedar fence was taking shape beautifully. For the first time in a while, I actually felt hopeful. Karen hadn't shown her face since the restraining order came through, and I naively started to think she'd learned her lesson. Then the call came. It was Luis again, and this time his voice was different. Not irritated or apologetic, but alarmed. "Eric, we've got a problem." I was instantly on edge. "What happened?" "The site was hit last night. Someone broke into the tool shed. Everything's gone. Power tools, nail guns, sealants, paint. Even the copper wiring we hadn't installed yet. All of it." I didn't speak for a moment. My mind reeled. "Any idea who did it?" Luis exhaled. "Number, but they weren't amateurs. They knew where to go. They cut through the side latch instead of busting the lock, used bolt cutters on the chains. Clean and fast." I jumped on my laptop and opened the camera feed. Error. All 3 external cameras were offline. I checked the system logs. They hadn't just failed. They'd been manually disabled. But the footage from the hours before the breach had been saved. I scrolled back, heart pounding, until I found it. 2:13 a.m. The yard was dark, silent, until a large shadow stepped over the fence. Then 2 more followed. 3 figures, all in black, faces masked, moved like they'd done this before. One was huge, massive, in fact. As soon as he hit the ground, he turned and pointed toward the back corner where the first camera was mounted. The smaller ones split off in different directions. Within minutes, they had found and destroyed all 3 cameras. The last image was of gloved hands reaching up, then static. I sat back in my chair, chilled to the bone. I recognized that big frame, that lumbering gate. I'd seen it once before, in the HOA office, the muscle. I saved the video, loaded it onto a drive, and drove straight to the police station. Officer Timmons met me again, and when he saw the footage, his face tightened. "You think that's the same guy from the HOA?" "I know it is," I said. "I saw him drag me out of Karen's office with my own eyes." Timmons sighed. "That's not enough to make an arrest. He's masked. No license plates, no clear facial features. We can bring him in for questioning, but unless he confesses—" I clenched my jaw. "So that's it? He just walks?" "For now," the officer said, voice grim. "But this isn't over, especially not if we get more evidence. The total damage was staggering. Between the stolen materials, tools, and repairs to the partially vandalized work, the estimate landed just shy of $40,000. Luis looked like he'd seen a ghost when I told him. "This is professional-level sabotage," he muttered. "Someone really doesn't want this project finished." "No," I said. "Not someone. Karen." There was no way she wasn't behind this. And if she thought I was going to back off, she had no idea what kind of fire she'd just lit. I wasn't the only one Karen had underestimated. A few days after the break-in, I stopped by the property to walk through the damage again. Not to wallow, but to plan. That's when I saw my neighbor Steve watering his lawn across the street. He gave me a long look, then waved me over. I crossed the road, still tired and half mad with stress, but something about the way he leaned on the fence caught my attention. "I heard what happened," he said. "That Karen's crew hit your site." I raised an eyebrow. "You think it was her?" Steve smirked. "I know it was. And you're not the only one she's been messing with." That's when he started to talk. And once he did, I realized something big had been brewing under the surface all along. Karen had only been HOA president for 3 months, but in that time she'd unleashed hell on the neighborhood. Massive fines for minor infractions, threats of liens over untrimmed hedges, special assessments that seemed to vanish into thin air. One elderly couple was fined nearly $1,000 for unauthorized lawn decor, a wooden duck. A guy down the block was charged for leaving his garage door open for more than 15 minutes. No joke, and everyone was fed up. Steve told me a group of residents had already started documenting everything. They'd been collecting emails, letters, voicemail rants, and even video clips. They'd been too afraid to act alone, but my situation, my fight, had lit a spark. "I've been waiting for someone to push back," Steve said. "You've already filed police reports. You've got proof. You've been vocal. People are ready to follow your lead. If you take this to court, we'll back you. With a class action if necessary." I stood there in stunned silence, then nodded slowly. "Then we build the case." That same day, I contacted my lawyer. By the end of the week, I had 3 more on board, all neighbors who had their own stories. I brought in a private investigator to start digging into Karen's background, and I mean really digging. Within days, we uncovered lawsuits in other counties, shady real estate dealings, and a handful of former HOA stints that had ended in sudden resignations. The woman left chaos wherever she went. Meanwhile, I turned my property into Fort Knox. I added new cameras, motion sensors, and even buried a few audio recorders near the fence line. Luis and his crew came back once again, resilient as hell, and pushed forward with the build. The fence went up, plank by plank, stretching high and proud around my land. Beautiful, sturdy, and very, very private. That's when Karen made her next move. Apparently enraged by the fence, she began going door to door with a clipboard, trying to collect signatures for a community aesthetics petition, demanding that I take it down. Her claim, that it disrupted the neighborhood's visual harmony. I braced for impact, but it never came. Not one person signed. Instead, I started getting texts, voicemails, even flash drives, neighbors forwarding audio of Karen threatening them for refusing. Every interaction documented, labeled, stored. A week later, Karen showed up at my gate, waving a sheet of paper in the air. 60% of the neighborhood wants that monstrosity gone, she barked. Either you take it down or we'll take legal action. I smiled. Is that so? You do realize you're violating a restraining order just by being here, right? She froze. I leaned in slightly, voice calm. And unless you want me to hand this little visit over to the cops, again, I'd suggest you turn around and walk away. She hesitated, lips twitching with fury, but said nothing. Then she turned and stormed off, muttering something about how I'd regret this. But I wasn't scared, not anymore, because I wasn't standing alone. It happened on a Tuesday night. The house was still under construction, so I wasn't staying there, just checking in daily to oversee progress. Lindsay and the kids were still at her parents' place, and I was splitting time between there and my lawyer's office, building the case piece by piece. Things had been quiet for a while. Too quiet. Karen hadn't made another appearance since our last exchange at the gate, and part of me hoped she'd finally gotten the message. That hope shattered at 2:08 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I rolled over groggily and squinted at the screen. It was a notification from the security system. Motion detected. Zone 3. Rear entry. Then another. Zone 1. Front gate. Then all zones lit up at once. I sat bolt upright, heart racing, and opened the live camera feed. 3 people were creeping across my yard, dressed in black, faces covered, gloves on. They moved quickly and deliberately, each one heading straight for one of the cameras, just like last time. Only this time, they didn't know I'd upgraded everything. The second they breached the perimeter, the silent alarm triggered. A direct alert was sent to the private security team I'd hired and to the local police department. I watched, breath caught in my throat, as one of the intruders pulled out bolt cutters and began snipping at the camera wires. Another was already working on the latch to the supply shed, but just as they turned to move deeper into the property, the floodlights snapped on. Then came the sirens. A black SUV from the security company came roaring up the drive, followed seconds later by 2 police cruisers. Red and blue lights lit up the yard like a concert. The would-be intruders froze, then tried to scatter, but they didn't get far. The officers tackled them before they made it 10 steps. I jumped into my truck and made it there in just over 10 minutes. By the time I arrived, the entire street was awake. Neighbors in robes and pajamas had gathered on sidewalks, whispering, watching the show unfold with stunned faces and cell phones in hand. And there, in the middle of it all, cuffed and fuming, was Karen. Karen, her muscle-bound enforcer, and a third man I recognized as the HOA's so-called maintenance inspector. I stopped in my tracks, stunned. The image didn't feel real. Karen, her blazer smeared with mud, her face red with rage, being loaded into the back of a patrol car while neighbors filmed and murmured. She saw me, locked eyes with me, and if looks could kill, I'd have dropped dead on the spot. I walked over to Officer Timmons, who was standing off to the side, arms crossed. "They really did it," I said, still half in disbelief. Timmons nodded slowly. "We got 'em, breaking and entering, violation of restraining order, possession of burglary tools. If the DA's even half awake, this is going to stick." He paused, then added, "Nice work with the security upgrades, by the way. You gave us everything we needed." I watched as Karen was driven away, the back of the cruiser vanishing into the night. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several neighbors clapped me on the back, shook my hand, or just whispered "thank you" as they returned to their homes. For the first time since this madness began, I felt something that had eluded me for weeks: relief. But it wasn't over. This wasn't just about fences or sabotage anymore. It was about justice. And it was coming. 3 weeks after the arrest, we were in court. Karen was facing a long list of charges: criminal trespass, conspiracy to commit burglary, violation of a restraining order, destruction of property, and theft. Her 2 accomplices, the HOA's hired muscle and the so-called maintenance inspector, were hit with similar charges. And to make matters worse for her, the footage I'd gathered, combined with eyewitness testimony and over 24 signed statements from neighbors, painted a damning portrait of a woman who'd weaponized her position to bully, extort, and manipulate an entire community. I sat beside my attorney watching Karen across the courtroom. She looked smaller now. Gone was the sharp blazer and confident smirk, replaced with a bland county-issued suit and eyes that flicked anxiously around the room. I saw her flinch as the prosecution played back the footage from my yard: the trespassing, the camera destruction, the confrontation with the police. I watched her shrink further as my neighbors, one after another, stood up to tell their stories. The fines, the threats, the lies, the trauma. This wasn't just about me anymore. It never had been. Karen had ruled over that HOA like a tyrant, using her authority as a weapon. And now, the people she had intimidated for months were standing tall and pushing back. One woman broke down in tears on the stand as she described being threatened with foreclosure over a garden statue. An elderly couple testified that Karen tried to charge them for unauthorized holiday decorations while their son was deployed overseas. The courtroom wasn't just full of evidence, it was full of fury. When it was my turn to testify, I told the whole story. From the first warning Karen gave my crew to the night of the second break-in, I showed the police reports, the security footage, the threatening letters, the forged petition she claimed had 60% support. And when my attorney asked why I had pursued this so relentlessly, I didn't hesitate. Because if someone like her can get away with this, what's to stop the next one? This isn't about a fence. This is about our right to feel safe in our homes, to make changes on our own land without fear, without being harassed, stalked, or stolen from. What happened to me could happen to any homeowner, and I wasn't about to let her win. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all counts. Karen was sentenced to 20 years in prison with no chance of parole for at least 12. Her two henchmen received slightly lighter sentences, but not by much. And when it came to restitution, the judge didn't hesitate. Karen and the Oak Crest HOA were held financially liable for the damages. Between court-ordered compensation and punitive damages for emotional distress and loss of property, I was awarded $250,000. And the best part? That ruling opened the door for a class action lawsuit from the rest of the neighborhood. Within a month, over 40 residents joined the case. The HOA board was dismantled, a court-appointed receiver was brought in to audit everything, and for the first time in years, the community actually had a say in what happened next. The old Karen regime? Gone. In its place, a group of level-headed neighborly volunteers stepped up. Steve, the guy who'd first rallied support, was voted in as the new HOA president. The bylaws were rewritten. Fines were frozen. Every abusive policy Karen had put in place was tossed out like last week's garbage. As for me, the house was finally finished. The new roof gleamed under the Florida sun. The cedar fence stood tall and proud, wrapped tightly around a property that was now secure, respected, and whole. Lindsay and the kids came back in time for summer, and we threw the biggest barbecue our street had ever seen. Neighbors came from every direction, some I'd never even met before, bringing coolers, chairs, and enough food to feed a small army. It wasn't just a party, it was a celebration of peace reclaimed, of justice served, of a bully finally being put in her place. One evening, a few weeks later, I stood alone in the yard, drink in hand, watching the sun dip low over the horizon. For the first time in months, I felt calm. No paranoia, no tension, just quiet. And then, as if life wanted to write one last poetic line, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Steve. Hey, Town Hall wants to use your story as a case study on HOA abuse. You cool with that? I smiled to myself and typed back. Absolutely. Let's make sure no one else has to deal with a Karen like ours ever again.